Can you see the problem? It is a big problem. A big problem. And in the outlines I've given you, many of you have printed them out, I know. You'll see that under each section of these particular things, we have listed a number of statements that we make to ourselves. So what I'd like to do is just read a few out for you. What helps me to deny, excuse, or justify or lie to myself to support my lack of faith? Well, let's look at the faith in God. I've listed, I tell myself God doesn't exist. We've already covered that. I tell myself I'm already a part of God. Isn't that convenient? I tell myself I can never really know God. I tell myself knowing, having faith in God is not important to my life. After you've just told yourself those four things, you will never have any faith in God. And remember, if you don't have any faith in God, there's very little you can do about it, developing a relationship with God and receiving love from God, and therefore receiving education from God. So basically, you've now just consigned your entire life to self-exploration with no assistance whatsoever from anybody who is actually in a higher condition than yourselves. That's what you've done. As soon as you do that. And the majority of people on the planet are perfectly happy with that. And in fact, the majority of people on the planet think that's the proper way to live. Have faith in how God created me. I tell myself that God didn't create me. I tell myself that human evolution is survival of the fittest. You know, it's the one who's the toughest and the most nasty that gets ahead, right? I tell myself that God created me imperfectly and we then justify the imperfection. Like, that's what religions do, right? The Christian religion is great at that one. I tell myself that God's creation of me was flawed. There was something wrong with me right from the beginning and we needed God to correct it. If we need God to correct it, why didn't he correct it right at the beginning? Not very logical, but that's how we think. I tell myself I do not have the capacity to become perfect. Now, most of you are telling yourself that every day. You sort of see perfection as some imaginary, like, utopian dream of some kind that will never become a reality. Like, I've got 100 million celestial friends who tell you differently, but that doesn't make any difference to you because you don't want to hear from them. When you're in that state, all you want to do is tell yourself that it's okay to be imperfect because that's a part of the flawed human condition. And isn't that convenient? You know, when we have a war, we go, oh, that's a part of the flawed human condition. When 100 million children die every year, we go, that's a part of the flawed human condition. You know, when someone in our family dies of cancer or some other disease, we go, that's a part of the flawed human condition. That's the way it goes. All very convenient. It stops us from examining the real reason why any of these events occur. That's what it does. It alleviates us from taking responsibility. We just don't want to take responsibility for the fact that we're choosing to remain unloving. And we are. Does that make sense? What else have I got here? I tell myself I can't change. I tell myself while I live on earth, I've got to conform to the rest of what the earth does. I tell myself that God and the world doesn't reward any goodness in a person. You know that, right? I know that too. You know, if you're a good person, what happens to you? You just get pummeled, right? I tell myself God doesn't care about anything. God created a harsh and dangerous universe. God is punishing and cruel. God is worse than the average human. God's a despot, a tyrant, and a narcissist. Human pain is God's problem. Human pleasure is fleeting and only based on getting addictions met. So after I've told myself all that, I don't have much faith in God's goodness, right? Faith in God's laws. I tell myself that my version of law is the only correct version of law. I tell myself there's no law but human law. God's laws can be manipulated and broken with impunity. I tell myself God's laws are inconsistent and unreliable, so there's no point in trying to understand them. And there's no benefits from following them either, and they're not loving or kind. So when you and I discuss the law of attraction, every single discussion I've ever had, I think, about the law of attraction, which is a beautiful, loving law, most people are trying to tell me how unloving it is. And I'll go, but it's not unloving because it's happening to you and it's a loving thing for it to be happening to you. God doesn't make an unloving law, but we want to believe that it is. Oh, it feels cruel and it feels harsh and it feels terrible, and you know. Same as the law of compensation. Why could God be so cruel and have people in the hells for thousands of years, you know, in such a dark condition? And all they did on earth was they just tried to be a good person. You know, this is our justifications. Faith in God's truth. I tell myself it's impossible to find out the absolute truth. If you had heard how many discussions I've had with people saying that there is such a thing as absolute truth, and they're saying to me, no, there's not, you would be absolutely astounded. I've had millions of conversations along those lines in my life where people are trying to tell me there's no such thing as absolute truth. The New Age movement tells you what? There's my truth and there's your truth. And you're allowed to have your truth and I'm allowed to have my truth. Isn't that so convenient? So that means if you and I disagree, we don't have to resolve anything. That's my truth and that's your truth. Right? I tell myself that what I believe is the truth. So if I don't believe something is false, and if I do believe something, then it must have been true. Right? I tell myself that what I know about myself is the real truth. This is a problem I find almost all the time. Every time I discuss another person's problem in front of you, you generally agree with me. But as soon as I discuss your problem in front of other people, you can't agree with me. What does that tell me? It tells me this is the problem. What I know about myself is the truth, is what all of you individually believe. But it's not God's truth. And therefore it's not the truth. It's just your imaginary desire to hold on to an unloving condition. I tell myself the truth is scary, the truth hurts, that ignorance is bliss, that it's not important anyway, that withholding the truth is actually loving, isn't it? I can't tell my husband that. He would be so hurt. I can't tell my wife that. She'd be so hurt. Does my bum look fat in these jeans? No, darling, it's fine. I lie. I tell myself that others will never accept God's truth, and so I need to first care for my own safety rather than worrying about God's truth. Right. So you know what happens then is I'm in one situation, I'll do one thing. I'm in another situation, I'll almost do exactly the opposite thing. And I'm in one situation with a bunch of people who want me to be loving, so I'll be loving. I'm in another situation with a bunch of people who don't want me to be loving, so I'll be unloving. I'll do whatever the people around me tell me to do because I'm afraid that if I don't do that, something might happen to me. They might attack me, or they might think I'm a bad person, or they might even try to hurt me in some way, or they might just say some things behind my back that are hurtful or whatever. And I don't want any of those things, so I'll just do whatever the person I'm with does. Right? Now, when it comes to faith in God's love, this is what we tell ourselves. God doesn't care. God's harsh. God's punishing and cruel. God's angry and wants to hurt me. God causes my pain. God is just a concept anyway. Love isn't powerful or strong. It's just weak anyway. And love can be taken from me. And love isn't an emotion anyway. It's just a thought. Right? There's whole movements on the internet, both in the Christian and the New Age faith, that are all saying that God's love is not an emotion. Isn't that convenient? You don't have to feel about it. You've just got to think about it. Right? Why do you want to tell yourself this terrible lies? Because it causes you to justify your lack of faith. How about faith in God's way? I tell myself, there's no such thing as sin. There's no penalties for sin. Sin's just a concept created by Christian faith. Addictions and facade are not sins. Sin is only dependent on human perception. In other words, some people think some things are wrong, but other people think those same things are right. Right? That my intellect is the strongest part of me and the emotions are the weakest part of you. So don't go about acting on an emotional level. You've got to act on a thought level, an intellectual level. I talk about God's love without feeling it. Most of you are guilty of that. And I want to believe I am following God's way when I plainly am not. And now that was just one list about the lack of faith. Now, one exercise that I feel that each of you need to really engage if you're going to be serious about examining the reasons why and how you remain unloving is to actually go through these particular 4 things and start looking at and examining and feeling about, and I would suggest firstly start writing down what are your personal justifications for these particular things. So what I would like you to do is to change this around and say, like, I do excuse, deny, justify, minimise or blame others for my lack of faith. What do I tell myself to do that? What are the kinds of things I feed myself on a daily basis to do that? And it can be just very simple, so simple like, yes, I know I should be doing that, but I don't have any faith in it. And that's it, the end of the story. You just feel you don't have any faith in it. And I would say to you, well, why don't you get some? Why don't you get some faith? You know, getting some faith is quite simple process actually. All you've got to do is put something to the test over a period of time and measure the results. That's all you've got to do. And then after that, you'll have some faith in the results. But of course, with God's stuff, it's got to be sincere. You can't just test it like a scientist without getting personally involved. You've got to be personally involved in the process. Right? It's got to be an emotional engagement of some kind for yourself. But you can grow your faith. So if you don't have any faith, it's nobody's fault other than your own. God's got huge amounts of evidence out there in the universe that God exists and that God's good and that all of God's laws are good and that if you follow God's laws, you will benefit from them and the whole world will benefit from them. There'll be less death, there'll be less destruction, there'll be less malnutrition, there'll be less wars and there'll be less everything. There's huge amounts of evidence about that. And yet, and what do we do? Oh, still really, it's convenient to have the doubt, right? Because the doubt lets us off the hook. The doubt lets us get away with behaviour that if we had no doubts, we knew we couldn't engage. Right? It's convenient to not resolve these questions. It's convenient. Now, my feelings are too that for many of you it's convenient to not resolve the question of who I am. It's convenient. Right? Because then you don't have to listen to things you don't like hearing. It's convenience. And this is what you do with God too. Same thing. Anything you don't want to hear, you just reject.